Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. We've had a few requests for a Hive Fleet Leviathan tutorial, and I wanted to do something a little different. A couple weeks ago I painted this vampire, and I thought the color scheme could be a good starting point for Hive Fleet Leviathan. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the model, I primed it using my favorite method, beginning with a gray primer all over, followed by a heavy layer of white from the top and sides. The result is a subtle, zenithal style undercoat with white on top, blending to gray on the underside. Alternatively, you could undercoat the model with gray cere or white spray and get great results too. Rather than starting with purple, I'd like to do something a little different on the skin. I began with an equal parts mix of Apothecary white and Mortarion grime. This makes a pale, greenish-gray kind of color. When using contrast paints, I like to work on one section at a time and apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then I'll go back with the brush and soak up any excess paint as needed. If you're going to paint a whole army with a custom color, I'd recommend mixing an entire bottle of it. That way you only have to mix it once. Check out this video here to see how I mix a custom color. Purple is the defining color for Leviathan, but rather than shade all over with purple like we usually see, I'd like to paint the ends of the limbs with Magos purple. It's really easy to get a blended effect with contrast paints. Just work on one section at a time and apply some paint. Then quickly rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and use the clean brush to blend out the edge. If you're not fast enough, the paint may start drying before you get the chance to blend it, and you can get a tide mark like this here. When this happens to me, I'll take a clean, damp brush and gently scrub the dried paint. Don't scrub too hard or you risk damaging the layers of paint beneath it. It should come off easily, and then you can try the blend again. I also painted the gun with Magos purple. Then, with a very fine brush, I painted Magos purple in the joints and along the edge of all the armor scales. I'd like to go with a dark purple for the scales, and I base coated the scales and claws with Shyish purple contrast paint. This color can look flat and uninteresting on its own, but I think it can look really good as a base coat with other colors layered over it. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. After the first layer dried, I painted a second layer to deepen the color and make the finish more even. Next, I added some depth to the gun with a shade of Druchii violet. Some paint has already spilled on the fingers here, and that's okay, I'll touch them up later. I changed my mind about these details, and I think they'd look better yellow instead of purple, so I painted them with toxic yellow. Then I shaded the yellow with Gryph-Hound orange. I painted the tongue with pink horror. Next I painted the teeth with bone white, making sure to leave a thin, dark outline around each tooth. At this stage you could base the model and call it finished. but I'd like to add some highlights, especially on the scales and claws, so let's keep going. Let's highlight the scales, and I'm going to use Screamer Pink in 2 stages. First, I want to paint a glaze. Thin down the paint with water, and with barely any paint on your brush, apply it on the raised edges of the scales. Notice how there's barely any paint coming off the brush, and it dries quickly. The most important thing to consider when glazing is how much paint is on the brush. The more water you add to the paint, the less you want on the brush. If you overload the brush too much, the paint will flow everywhere. Less paint on the brush will give you more control over it. Build up a couple layers until you're happy with the results. Next, I used a sharper brush and grabbed some thicker, undiluted Screamer Pink, and I painted it on the edges of the scales. I also like to add a few lines here and there to make the scales more interesting. I'd like to add one more highlight, but the scales are looking too red for my liking. So instead of using pink or mixing in white, I'm going to use a cooler, blue-leaning purple for the highlight. I used a sharp brush and painted Genestealer purple on the sharpest edges and corners. I still want the scales to look dark as well, so I'm trying to keep these highlights as narrow as possible. Next, let's highlight the claws, and I think some cool tones would complement the purple on the rest of the model. I highlighted the edges of the hooves and claws with Incubi darkness. The Shyish purple base coat is nearly black on my model, but if yours isn't dark enough, you may want to paint over it with Black Templar first. For the next highlight, I mixed equal parts Incubi Darkness and Fenrisian Grey. Thunderhawk Blue is a very similar color if you don't want to mix anything, but I'd encourage you to try out this mix. I like it a lot more. Thunderhawk Blue is a very weak paint, and this mix is stronger in pigment and has much better coverage. Finally, I added one more highlight with Fenrisian Grey on the very edges and corners. Next, I touched up the skin with Grey number 7 from my custom Grey scale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. I got lucky on my model and this Grey was a near perfect match. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Grey Sear would be close, but you may need to adjust it slightly depending on variables like your primer and how heavy or dark your base coat layer was. Using pure white, I painted a final edge highlight on the skin. If I were painting an army of these, I would be tempted to dry brush this highlight. If that were the case, I would do the dry brush step at the very beginning, before painting the scales and everything else, since dry brushing can get messy. Next I highlighted the yellow details back up with toxic yellow. I mixed some white into the Genestealer purple and highlighted the edges of the gun. And then I mixed some white into the pink horror and highlighted the tongue. I used an old brush to apply textured paste to the base, and before that dried, I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the textured paste dried, I painted the entire base with a layer of thinned Doombull brown. Then I dry brushed the base with Skrag brown, followed by Jokaero orange. I'd like to add a dusty effect to the feet. A lot of painters like using weathering powders, but I prefer to use paint instead. Thin down some Skrag brown with plenty of water, and using an old brush, grab some paint and wipe most of it off on a paper towel. With barely any paint on the brush, lightly scrub wherever you want a dusty look. I guess you could call this a cross between a dry brush and a glaze. Next I painted the rocks with Basilicanum Gray, and then I painted the edge of the base with black. After the paint dried, I applied patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I really enjoyed painting this model. There are a lot of Hive Fleet Leviathan models out there, and I wanted to try and do something a little different. I think the pale gray skin is a nice contrast to the dark purple. What do you think? Does the color scheme work well for Leviathan, or do you prefer the studio version? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.